Welcome to The Mountain Pass, a podcast about lifelong learning, curiosity, and our wonderful brain. Topics we love at Alpe Audio. But this isn't a podcast about Alpe, the product. Rather, it's conversations driven by our curiosity. Today I'm interviewing Professor William Kolbrener, an English professor at Bar Ilan University, who's published books on Milton and Soloveitchik, among others. We've recently worked on his Alpe course, Shakespeare and the Modern Individual, which opened my eyes to the world of teaching literature. I wanted to talk to Bill about what it's like teaching Shakespeare, and that led us down a fascinating conversation on the divine, what makes great works of art, and his framework for teaching, which I loved. Enjoy. Bill, welcome to the Mountain Pass. It's great to have you here. We are just...
Great to be here.
My pleasure. And we're wrapping up the Shakespeare for the Modern Individual, or the Modern Individual from Shakespeare, which is a course we put up on Alpe a month or two ago. And that sparked my interest in kind of diving into your whole teaching philosophy. Why do you teach? What's your goal when you step into a classroom? What do students come away with? And this is all stems from my process of going through your course, which was just very different from the other courses that we have on Alpe. So I will let you take it away from there.
I think that's such a great question, really. Right. So, I mean, my understanding is Alpe does mostly things that are connected to pragmatic knowledge. And Shakespeare, obviously, as anybody's who has children as an English major, or who is an English major themselves and has parents, we know the question, what good is that going to do you? And I mean, it is really, I think, a burning question, and the question really does have to be answered. And I think it's an especially good question because of the last year that most of us, humanists, scientists, everyone have been teaching around the world, and that is on Zoom. And for me, I think for everybody, Zoom was a transition. And I think it's hard to underestimate the kind of trauma of this experience that young people are having, where their futures are suddenly not so clear. And looking at the faces of students on Zoom, there's a certain kind of presence about Zoom which is not available in the classroom. The classroom has other things which make it better. But there is something about Zoom and the presence of the other face that I think really made me feel really responsible as a teacher. I think I've always felt that to a certain extent, but I began to really give words to that, to the responsibility that teachers have to make themselves present to their students. Now, that doesn't mean telling you my favorite ice cream or what composer I like best, the latter it might, but it means looking and listening, really, and listening to questions. And I think that's what we do as teachers, as we learn, or what we're meant to do as humanists, as readers, is to teach reading. And reading is kind of the ultimate form of attention, giving attention to another. And when we do that, I compare it to the way the rabbis look at Revelation, in a sense. That the rabbis look at the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai as not only a depositing of the law to the Jewish people, but the way I see it is what happens on Mount Sinai, and this is a universal revelation, it is the revelation of the possibility of revelation. It is the possibility of being in contact with something divine. Now, divine is always a hard word because it stops people up and people think, I don't believe in that, or what do you mean by that? And what I mean by the divine is really, another word would be the infinite, or what Hamlet says to Horatio, there is more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, my dear Horatio. And when we have this encounter with great works, like Shakespeare is a form of revelation, but I'm using this metaphorically, but it's not complete until we read him. And in some sense, it's as if Shakespeare is coming towards us all great writers are like this. I write on John Milton, as you know, the author of Paradise Lost. His voice is so strong that one really feels it the most, that he's really coming out to meet you. And he wants to be read properly. Rembrandt is another great example of this. The painter is always, from some perspective, looking at you and asking you, can you read this? Do you understand this? So really getting back to your question is, great works teach us how to read. They teach us not only how to read themselves, right? When I read Homer's The Odyssey, Homer teaches me, he shows me how to read the text because he has other people, he has people inside of the work either reading properly or failing to read. The thing about great authors is they not only teach you how to read the work that you're reading, they teach you to read beyond them. That's what is the transcendent aspect of great books. That is, they not only teach you how to read them, they teach you to go beyond them and to read yourself and others, your present, beyond them. No great book says stop here. And teaching Shakespeare, that's the ultimate, really. I mean, Shakespeare and Rembrandt, I think those are the two artists on the same plane. And I mentioned Milton and Homer, but really Rembrandt and Shakespeare so much embody that sense of summoning readers and asking them to read. So it's been an education over the past year, feeling the presence of the students, feeling their urgency, because the urgency is real. And no matter what, we read in about woke education and the humanities being dead, when people are suffering crisis, as we were and are to a lesser extent, I guess now, the Excel sheet's not going to do it, right? There are things that go beyond the Excel sheet, and only the humanities answer these questions. And they don't answer the questions. They give a language through which you can ask them. I think that's the most important thing about the humanities. That is, when you get old, you have something to think about other than what new car you're going to buy. And I'm not being just kind of condescending and facetious there. A life of reading allows one to continue reading when one gets older. And it's not just objects around you that take your attention, but you've become a reader of life. In a way, we aspire to all becoming Hamlets. That's, of course, one of the plays that, if you're giving a lecture about Shakespeare and the modern individual, Hamlet is at the center of that. And Hamlet is an individual because he knows how to read. He knows how to read himself. He knows how to read others. He is conscious of himself in ways that others are not. And that's what the humanities do. And that's what reading Shakespeare does.
So there is a lot that I want to unpack in that. But I will start with, do you think reading lets you read those people around you, situations, or the world in a better, different light than other modern formats? I'm a big reader myself. I've been reading ever since I can remember myself. I've never connected to movies, Netflix, or anything else quite as much as I've connected to reading. But most of my friends are the polar opposite. And this is kind of a debate that I have with them that I've been having over the past 5 or 10 years. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I watch, true confession, I watched a lot of Netflix over the past year and a half. But I think that's a different form of attention, really. And I mean, you can give, and when I say form of attention, what I mean is a way we look at a book or at a person with both intensity and receptivity. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. That you are present to the person and you do not abandon your critical faculties when reading a text or reading a person. I notice I'm talking about both at the same time, and I think that's important. But there's also that receptiveness, that openness, that generosity. In the American university today, I think everything, I mean, this is clear. it's true in many universities here as well, that every relationship is reduced to power. When every relationship is reduced to power, teaching becomes suspect, as it's been called at the best educational institutions in the world, where Harvard law students are questioning the hierarchy by which they are subordinated to teachers. And then relationships also are always just suspicious because really they're about conquest. And reading, and one of the reasons I emphasize the divine or the infinite, is reading makes us look past that. Is reading allows us, reading properly, reading with that receptivity and generosity allows us to hear other people speak. And whether it's Shakespeare or Milton or our friends, I don't know how you can be a good friend if you think that all relationships are somehow subject or are really expressions of power. And the falling, this is what I thought you were asking before, the humanities classroom in America is falling apart because if you can't read a text with generosity, how can you read each other with generosity? The model for reading is something's going on in the head of Shakespeare that he doesn't know and we know, and we'll describe it. So I think that genuine reading is a form of openness. And I don't know, I think, you can give that form of attention to great films, to great art. I think the way most of us watch Netflix, it's a different form of attention. And the form of attention that's required in the classroom from both students and teachers, but especially teachers, is being present.
What do you mean by reading with generosity?
I don't know. Do you ever have bad days where you're pretty sure that everything that everybody is saying to you is somehow some kind of underhanded attack on you?
You're 5 times a week.
You're a much nicer person than I am. But that's how we mostly read everything. And reading with generosity is this person. There are all these assumptions that people want to question. That the person has something to say. The author is not dead, nor is the person across from me dead. And the humility is this person has something to convey to me. And I want to know it. And I want to make myself present to it. All the more so with Shakespeare and the way, or Milton or whatever, or Jane Austen or Virginia Woolf. When you're in the presence of those texts, you either meet the demand of the author or you don't. And if you just describe it as a history of, as implicit within text, the history of economic relations, suppressed psychological, suppressed desire, all of those approaches, Marxist, psychoanalytic, feminist, they're all useful. And those are the ones that completely dominate the American university today. And they're all useful. And if you don't know how to do that, you'll probably be a bad reader. But the first thing in reading is you're saying something. What is it you're saying? And with literary texts, with literary texts, like with God, you're never going to figure out what Shakespeare is saying. Not in one shot, not in one take. It requires more and more reading. That's, I think, the way in which, as I was saying before, the relationship between writer and author mirrors that of the divine and those to whom he reveals himself. The author is revealing himself. The author is revealing something he knows or that she knows. And that itself involves certain assumptions about, well, what do they know and how do they know it and how can they express what they know? But one feels in great writers, great authors, great painters, the urgency to express oneself. And we try to be present to that, to be present to the voice of others. And the reason that's so important is because when we're present to the voice of others, we get our own voice. When we see what a voice is. The voice of the other doesn't, if taught properly, does not trample me. It does not erase me. It enables me.
So what I very much relate actually to that, the way you just defined reading with generosity. And it struck me, I think very deeply, one of the more transformative things that I've gone through, going back to the divine, just because that's something you've brought up, but that's also where it touched me, is one of my relationships with learning Talmud, which is this large Jewish corpus, was when I think during high school I read it very ungenerously. And then after serving in the military, I came back to study, and that was the shift, that I was approaching it with, there is a lot for me to learn from this.
What was it about the military that made you change your perspective on it?
I don't think it was necessarily the military. It was a thought that I already had in high school and the year of study that I had done after, which was this feeling of A, I was a bad student, B, I almost got kicked out of yeshiva, which isn't an easy feat. And C,
I think that's a prerequisite for graduation, right?
maybe. But it was really this feeling of awe, and that I'm not swimming, I've dipped my toe into this immense corpus of knowledge and thought, and people who have been there before me and contemplated it and written on almost everything that I could even imagine. And humility of just, I don't even know what I don't know. And then after the military, it was also, I guess, that having stewed and then finding the right teacher that really helped. And approaching the text with that generous mindset really helped me get there. I wonder, when it comes to great works, if at some point, like, great works even take that away from you because they're great.
I mean, that's true not only of Shakespeare or Milton, that's also true of Talmud.
Yeah.
So as to your question about whether great works are silencing, really, in the end, and there's certainly a way in which they can be. The literary critic Harold Bloom talks about the anxiety of influence. It's an extremely interesting perspective on reading. That really great authors, in order for them to become great, and this really follows from your question, they have to kill off the person who came before them, right? So Milton, in order to become Milton, has to kill off Shakespeare. It's a very useful way of reading, because Milton really does kill off Shakespeare. And that's what makes him great, is the way he distinguishes himself from Shakespeare. But he needs, according to Bloom, you need this tremendous strength and power in order to, like, vanquish the precedent works. But I think that's only one model. And I think great works, as I was saying before, they encourage us to read them and to find our voices in relationship to them. I mean, let's keep on talking about Milton just for a second, right? I mean, I'm an Orthodox Jew, let's say, right? And I come to read John Milton, and he shares none of my assumptions. I mean, he shares some of my assumptions, but many of the assumptions he has, I not only exclude me, but erase me, right? And nonetheless, there is a way of reading Milton, for me to read Milton, to bring out something that makes sense to me, that helps me form my identity. There are many people who revere texts, and through that reverence, they kill them. And that can happen in academic contexts or in religious contexts. Certainly, you can see the way in which certain communities' reverence of the text of which they think they are the guardian really kills it off and makes it a dead text. And we can do the same thing with Shakespeare. And I mean, I think we do the same thing with paintings all the time, because we walk through museums. And if you're in a really good museum, like the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, you walk through these museums, and you're passing work after work after work after work that is calling out to you and saying, "Read me." I have a friend who made a trip through Italy, and he went to very small villages, and every village had, or town or whatever, had a museum, and usually there would be one painting there that was a masterwork. Let's call it that. And he said that made sense, because he could sit and look at it for a couple of hours. So there is a kind of reverence the reverence of the masterpiece, where we look at it as a masterpiece and it's not speaking to us. Once a work is speaking to us, and that is the part that is there's this kind of double aspect of reading. There's the reading of the work, but the reading of the work is always a writing of the self at the same time. It's me reading. Now, and this is where anti-humanists jump up and down and say, yeah, you see the subject. And the answer is yes, the subject. It is me reading and trying to, and through my deep knowledge, which I have of Shakespeare, or which I have of Milton, I am able to bring out something that's implicit in the text. It's that, and that moment of reading really is the moment of revelation. We both have been talking about our common religious context. There is a midrash, what people call a legend, about how some rabbis in the 4th century are hanging around Babylonia and arguing about a certain point in Jewish law. And as they're doing so, the clouds and the lightning and the thunder from Mount Sinai is surrounding them. And as they're speaking, the words are dancing with joy, right? The rabbis are poets, and they're emphasizing the extent to which even centuries later, and these rabbis are like minor rabbis, they're not even the famous ones, not Rabbi Akiva or anybody like that. They're minor rabbis you haven't heard of. Even in this place in Babylonia with 4 rabbis you haven't heard of arguing about a small legal point, there is that moment of revelation. And it's that, going back to your question, it's going back to the past, but through reading, I'm moving into the future, because I'm reading myself. I'm writing myself. I'm taking myself into the future.
Do you think there's something about the layers that make it great or even correlate? Because one of my experiences when listening to your Shakespeare course was really the layers deep. And of course, it makes sense. Shakespeare is a complicated writer. We are complicated readers. But I think it really is part of the greatness of you. There's a surface reading, and then there are multiple layers of comprehension or implicit meaning.
So I think, I mean, we both know that in the Talmud there's this idea of right. So we both know in the Talmud there's this conception of the Pardes, the orchard, where rabbis go, and the Pardes stands for different kinds of interpretation: the simple meaning, the allegorical meaning, the secret meaning. So that's true in a Talmudic context, and there is, I think, definitely a relationship between the way the rabbis think about knowledge and somebody like Shakespeare or Rembrandt, and that's maybe for another time. But Shakespeare and Rembrandt, I think, going back to your question, they make art possible in the modern world. What do I mean by that? Up until then, art is subordinated to the church. When fundamentalism fails, especially in England with the English Civil War, and somebody has to theorize a way of living in the world which does not involve just the conflict between different absolutes, Catholics, Protestants, whatever. I mean, John Locke is, of course, the person who does that. He creates liberalism and toleration. But Rembrandt and Shakespeare give art a non-fundamentalist future. And Milton doesn't. Milton in Paradise Lost, his vision of the world ends with his poetry, because he, in some sense, as great as he is a fundamentalist from our perspective of a sort. But Shakespeare opens. Shakespeare not only has layers, it demands different readings and different readers. In our series, I mentioned that Shakespeare plays the role of the ghost of Hamlet. The ghost of the older Hamlet, who instructs his son to revenge his murder. And Shakespeare has that role in the first Globe production, and he calls out, "Remember me." And Shakespeare knows what he's doing about everything. And that call is not only to Hamlet, it's a call to the audience in the Globe, it's a call to the future. It's a call really And Hamlet, in a way, is the ur text of modern literature, meaning it starts everything. Everything after Hamlet is a commentary on Hamlet, which is, I know, a very exaggerated way of putting what you said. There are many layers and meanings, and great authors can do this, and this is part of the generosity that we have to them and to ourselves in allowing us to read them. Great authors open up works to possibilities that we can't imagine when we read them superficially. And we can't even imagine, even when we read them in a way alone. And of course, in a Talmudic situation, you mentioned your time in yeshiva, you learn, you study a text. The text is in between two people. You study as partners, because there is an assumption there as well that in order for the voice to speak, the text, whatever that is, the voices to speak, it needs more than one person to discuss it. Because if you see things from one perspective, you're seeing it wrong. If you think you know what Shakespeare means, you're misreading him, right? If you think you know what Shakespeare is doing, you're misreading, which doesn't mean you shouldn't try. But if you ever get to the point and say, oh, I got it, right, you're wrong. It's the same thing about a Rembrandt painting. It's easier with visual arts because you can see it. If you think you're seeing a Rembrandt painting, you're not seeing it because it refuses to be seen. That's what great works do, is they refuse to be read easily. You're going to have to try. It really is a summoning. Great texts summon you. And again, Excel sheets don't. And the question is, that's what the humanities, their job is to summon you. And that's, I'm just saying here in Israel, in our classroom at Bar Ilan University, in the English department, where we have a wide variety of different students, Muslims, Christians, Jews, we talk a lot about that summoning and how it's different and what it means for all of us and how it's different because we are also different. So teaching is the biggest opportunity we have now.
So how do you like, what is this might be the wrong question, but what is the goal when you step into a classroom or on a Zoom screen? Is it to teach someone to read? Is it to summon them and make them feel? At the end of the day, I think in university, you have an exam, you have a paper, which I actually think is one of the problems.
What do you want? What do you want on the exam? Right. We can't ignore the institutional framework for this happening. I mean, thank God for the institutional framework, because otherwise it wouldn't happen at all. And I see that the summoning it's a bad metaphor because it gets misconstrued. And summoning is not about feeling only. It's in a way providing a language for the soul. And that language includes that's how I think of prayer, and really, in a way. It's just giving you language to talk about stuff. It's there. The stuff is there, right? That's what I said before about the students. The stuff is there. It's all there. And they're so present, and you can feel it in the lump in their throat. And you want to give them a chance to express it. And great works do that. They give you words. They give you languages to express it. And you know what? The better you do on the exam, the more likely the two things are ideally, and of course, student psychology is not like this. If they show up, and I say this, especially during Zoom, if they show up and if they're present, they're going to do well. For many, many reasons. Show up, you'll do well. And it's not only because I'm nice, because I realize that showing up was, especially in the early days in the spring of 2020, showing up was a heroic thing for students, right? But I don't only mean it in that sense now. I mean, show up and make yourself present, read, be addressed. Saying all of these things, to read and be addressed, we have this tendency still to look at, reading and summoning, that's for something else. That's for humanists. We have our goals. I mean, it's contemporary university, an adjunct of the corporate world. And they're very pragmatic goals, and we don't need the subject at all. And guess what? You need the subject, because you need the subject to live.
Because reading is not only a question of reading books, it's a question of reading people, it's a question of reading situations. I mean, just to plug for English majors, my English majors in our classes have the coolest jobs you can imagine because they know how to read. I mean, they work in high tech, they work they know how language works and they know how to use it. And there's huge demand for that. So apply to Bar Ilan. I'm just saying what we do in literature, it's not detached from other things that we do. It's part it's part of who we are. And I think learning to have that form of attention, learning to have a voice, and even more importantly, which I didn't mention yet, and I mentioned our multicultural classroom, learning that I can have a voice in relationship to somebody else sitting next to me who has a different tradition. And her sacred book is different than my sacred book. And yet I'm saying outside of the classroom, we have different assumptions, but we can sit and read texts which are not normative really for any of us, because for whom is Paradise Lost normative, right? Not for me as a Jew, and not for Muslims as devoted Muslims. But we can sit next to each other and we can read these great works, not to become Milton, and not so like in some American formula, we put aside our primitive assumptions about God and religion and become rationalists or supposedly rationalists like our woke professors. I think that's a terribly damaging pedagogy, and I think it exists. But the idea is for the smarter professors to undo the beliefs of their students. And our aim is to allow our students to have a more creative relationship to their own beliefs. When they see the way in which traditions are made through the participation of people, humanism is the only way that God comes into the world. The human is the way that God comes into the world, because the human is meeting God halfway, or meeting the divine halfway. So we see that that's created, and that saying it's created is not to put on your heresy alert. I live in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, so I'm always thinking of the sirens going off when I say things. To say it's created is not to demystify it and get rid of it. It's to celebrate it, that the human itself is part of this divine interaction. And again, what I mean that experience that you have when you read books that you love, or when you're sitting learning Talmud in some way. That experience, which we know is transcendent. Unfortunately, religious people have monopolized the words that we use to describe those experiences. So we lose track of the fact that they are basically human. And that experience is expressed differently by different people, which goes back to the multiplicity that you see in Shakespeare, the multiplicity that we see in our classroom, learning how to read together. And I think, and that seems to me to be the task of the contemporary university, because nobody is doing that outside. There is so little conversation in the public sphere because there is so much defensiveness. It's interesting that for us here in Israel, we get more done because we're not like many Americans already tired of liberalism and happy to undo it. People here in our classes are very grateful for liberalism. They're very grateful for toleration. They're very grateful for the opportunity to read aside people who are different from them. So the humanities it's a life task in a way. But I will tell you how to study for the exam.
What do you think is challenging beyond having a diverse group of readers with a diverse group of backgrounds? What are the main challenges that you encounter when you're teaching Shakespeare or Milton or Rembrandt?
I'm not sure what you're asking. You're asking what are the challenges in relationship to the text or relationship to the students?
In relation to your goal as a teacher.
Well, Shakespeare's hard. right? It demands it demands a certain form of attention, and it's up to the teacher to elicit that this is going to be worth your while. That, I mean, I think there are three things that a student needs in a course, and that is to have faith in the text that it's saying something, to have faith in themselves that they know how to read, and that's the hardest one. That is the hardest one. But also in the second one, and this is what everything and the other two depend upon, is faith in the instructor. Faith in the instructor that he is he is teaching you to the best that he can. And Milton has this anxiety in Paradise Lost. He knows stuff, and he wonders if it's maybe not lawful to reveal things that he says are invisible to mortal sight. Maybe I shouldn't tell you. But Milton, and this is the reason, one of the reasons he's my model, he feels the urgency of the necessity of teaching. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this properly. I may not say it properly. I may betray it as I'm saying it, but I feel obligated to do it. And why do I feel obligated to do it? Because you are there. I mean, and getting back to your question, one has to teach, when you're teaching Shakespeare, a different set of languages. Right? You don't speak this yet, or especially Milton. You don't speak 17th century Puritan. And you have to learn that language, not to accept it, but through learning that language, so much more becomes available to you. It's kind of the scaffolding through which the poet works. Dante in the Inferno uses, the Catholic hell. That's the kind of the structural equipment for the Inferno is Catholic theology. Same for Milton. Shakespeare different altogether, because it's very hard to locate Shakespeare's voice, which makes him in a way the hardest, because he's doing so, as you said, he's doing so much at one time.
The framing it that Shakespeare itself is difficult, Milton itself is difficult, is actually interesting, because often when things are a challenge, we inherently grant them more weight. But I really love the triple framework of, you need to have faith in the material, you need to have faith in yourself, and you need to have faith the teacher will bridge that gap. I really love that kind of triple framework of what it is to be a teacher and what it is to be a student, encountering texts, encountering any body of information. You're working on something now, right? Literature and the sacred God and reading in the time of pandemic.
I mean, in a way, you're teaching students how you're always teaching, and this is what the rabbis do explicitly, is you're teaching your student to become a better version of you. You're teaching them to become teachers. You're teaching them to become leaders, and they become a better version of you because they're them, right? That is the goal of the humanities, that they become leaders, and they can only become leaders if they feel their own voice, if they feel they have that voice. So yes, I am writing. I'm writing a book on. It's called Literature and the Sacred God and Reading in a Time of Pandemic, and it focuses really on the, not surprisingly, on the people we've been discussing today, the rabbis of the Talmud, Rembrandt, Shakespeare, Milton, and a little bit of a coming attraction, which kind of dovetails with our discussion, is what I do in the book is talk about Midrash, and most people have heard about Midrash. Midrash, I guess, would be the best way of describing it as a kind of interpretive story. The rabbis invent this genre as a way of understanding the written law, which again, we said, it is so complex that the only way you can understand it is through continuing to reread it. So Midrash is not only a genre, it's a way of reading. And I mention this and I center on it in the book because Milton and Rembrandt were both in their own right midrashists. What I mean in simple terms is they took Old Testament stories and retold them. Rembrandt does that all the time. And of course, Milton writes Paradise Lost. He's rewriting parts of Genesis. He writes Samson Agonistes. He's rewriting parts of Judges. And it's not just, I'm not just mentioning that as a kind of cool idea. Milton knew
Midrash. He had it in his library, and he stole from one of the Midrashic collections. He had it in Latin. Rembrandt lived in Jewish Amsterdam, around the corner from Spinoza, and more importantly, the greatest rabbi of his generation, Menashe ben Israel. And it's very clear when you look at Rembrandt from that point of view, and use this lens of Midrash, it's extremely helpful. Why is it helpful? Because it shows the way, and this is the dynamics of Midrashes, going back into the past. But this is what the rabbis do as well. They bring it into their present, and because they're bringing it into their present, they're bringing it into a future. They're making a future out of the text of the past. And that's what I see as we've been discussing, really. Shakespeare more complicated, but certainly Rembrandt and Milton are rewriting these Old Testament stories in ways that are shocking and surprising. And they do it really, again, out of what I think is the same kind of humanist dynamic. And the rabbis, I think, are Jewish humanists. They go back to the past in order to make the present and to go into the future, right? The model is not the past kills you and shuts you up. Although that's unfortunately, institutionally, the way a lot of religions work, is the past is guarded as this thing that we know, that is the priests or whatever, or the rabbis. We know it, so don't bother. That's the unfortunate sheen that the masterpiece sometimes has. The masterpiece or the masterwork or the sacred work you're prevented from reading it because you don't know how. And being able to read it is participating in that process. The sacred, and this is what the book is about, the sacred in its many forms only happens in that activity of reading, that activity of faith, and the three things we spoke about. They're tied together.
So where can people find your work when it comes out?
I don't have a publisher yet for my book, and this has really been the COVID book, and very much dedicated to my students. And when I come out of my office and have a manuscript in hand, which I hope will be soon, I'll know where it's hopefully going to find a place in a bookstore near you.
Well, we will share it with the students.
That's very aspirational. Hopefully it'll be published somewhere, right? It'll be an Amazon.
Amazing, Bill. Thanks so much for the time, for coming on the podcast. This has been fascinating.
Excellent. Should be in touch. Call to. Be well.
Call to.